I'm Quincy Darbyshire. I'm a business partner at Fullcast, where I help customers navigate their sales planning and sales strategy considerations, both through our software, as Bala demoed earlier, and then also through strategic support. Before Fullcast, I spent a lot of time at Salesforce working in supporting sales planning, both in North America and in APAC. Carved a lot of territories, set a lot of quota, had a lot of fun. And I think the more exciting thing for me today, though, is to introduce Dorota, who's going to share a lot of her experience. She's been in sales strategy and planning for way over a decade and has spent the majority of that at Salesforce running strategy and planning. She's a vice president there and has seen a lot of growth, as Bala talked about earlier, because overlapped in similar time. 30% growth year over year, going from hundreds of sales employees to thousands of sales employees is a big task, and we're lucky to have her. So before we get into everything, though, just throwing out this last framing of everything. This is something Fullcast really believes strongly in. It's been a theme of today, this tight integration between planning, which we're going to talk about, and execution. So even though we'll be discussing mostly planning in this session, thinking about how it ties to execution, both from an implementation standpoint, but then also considering that you're still executing all the time while you're trying to think long-term as a sales operations person, the business is still running, are both real big considerations. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dorota.
Fantastic. So we've introduced ourselves and introduced our agenda, but I'd like to learn a little bit more about all of you. So let's start with some audience polling. So raise your hand if your sales organization is less than 10 people. Interesting. What about more than 100? More than 1,000? 10,000? Interesting. How many of you are single product companies? Okay. How about 3 or more products? All right. How many of you are only US based? How many of you are global? Fantastic. So today's conversation will span all of those topics, and there will be tidbits for you to take away regardless of the complexity of your company or where you are in terms of your life cycle. There will be a lot of "it depends," which I heard being murmured through the other presentations, but it really does. But all of our tips and tricks can be tailored to your organization. So before we dive into the nitty-gritty, let's take a step back and just align on the values, the goals, and the best practices of how one actually does sales planning for a growth company. So values. Values are all about executing against the strategic agendas. The strategic agendas of sales, as well as the strategic agendas of the CEO. Goals. Targets, targets, targets. So beating those bookings targets, but then also making sure you have the right resource capacity in place at the right time so you can conceivably achieve those targets. Third, all about a fast start. So this is hitting the ground running on day one, making sure that everyone knows what their role is, knows what their manager is, and knows what they're supposed to be doing so they can focus. And then lastly, iteration. So taking a look back in terms of what has happened in investing in the prior year, doubling down where it makes sense, and then pivoting. And so it's this, you're going to see a theme of a feedback loop and constantly iterating, constantly learning and evolving. Best in class. So this is something Quincy and I talked about a lot. We both get asked a lot, what does it mean to be best in class? And it does depend on the maturity of your company, the complexity of your product suite, the number of salespeople. But time and time again, 3 elements stay the same. The first one's all about transparency and communication. Communication in terms of being lockstep with your sales leadership, and then also communication with all of those other supporting roles who are working together for the annual planning cycle. This is finance, this is HR, or as we like to call it in tech, employee success, IT, marketing. Everyone has to have that feedback loop. Secondly, it's all about balance. Balance territories for your AEs so that they're incented, right, to perform because there's a chance of success, but also so that legitimately they can succeed. And then lastly, early execution. Murphy's Law is going to happen. The sooner you get your deliverables done, the sooner you start that feedback loop, the greater of a chance you have to actually get things done on time. Let me pause there for a second. And is there anything we're missing? Anything else that anyone would want to call out as a goal, value, best in class? All right. So here's what we're going to dive into. We've broken down the sales planning cycle into 8 steps. And the rest of today, we're going to deep dive into each of these steps. As Quincy said, we only have so much time. So I will give high-level thoughts in terms of what are the key takeaways, and then and some tips and tricks along the way as well. So the 8 steps are going to be identifying your ICP, sizing the market, confirming financial targets, determining the capacity needs, carving the segments and territories, finalizing quota and comp, implementing your decisions, and reviewing performance. But before we jump into that, let's talk a little bit about timeline. So on this slide, I have, again, the 8 steps on the left-hand side, and then these green blocks of approximate time. So 2 things should jump out at you immediately when you look at this slide. The first one, it's a timeline without time, right? So this could be 8 months. This could be 8 weeks. Hopefully not 8 days. But again, depending on the complexity of your product portfolio, the size of your sales team, the multinational nature, these steps have to happen, but how long it takes is really dependent on that. Secondly, all of the green blocks overlap, right? They're concurrent. Remember how I said feedback loop? So you could conceivably break these up and chunk these up as separate deliverables, right? Get everything done, take it, get feedback. But then you're going to have to be redoing and iterating. Because really the amount that you learn, even from fiscal year to fiscal year, is enormous. And so it's the continual learning, continual feeding in, and that feedback loop, which will really allow you to be the most successful and to really plan for growth.
So question on this one, Dorota. Salesforce calls sales planning go for growth.
Yes.
It's all about going for growth. Where does Salesforce fit on this timeline? And how has it changed since you started to now? So we are closer to the 8 months part of the cycle. And some of that is, it's not necessarily that every single team is executing. There is data cleanliness was a theme today, right? So we're super rigorous in terms of our cleanliness process. So we definitely err on that side, but it's always been a large chunk of the year. It's changed in terms of where our focus is as we automate more, as we get better at certain pieces, but then we'll just dig in deeper and do more analytics on another side. But it sounds like you're really, the company is always thinking about growth and always thinking about planning, and even though it's 8 months long, it's broken out, but it's like, it's a constant thought, and these steps are kind of always on people's minds.
Yep, definitely. All right, so this is the hopefully semi-interactive part of today. So on each of your tables, we've put out some handouts. And so this is the first draft of our workshop template. And it's built out as a grid, right? So you'll see some starter questions, metrics, stakeholders, and outcomes for every single process step. I encourage you to do a couple of things. First, as we're going through each of these steps, take notes, right? What struck you the most? What do you agree with, disagree with? What would be most helpful? And then secondly, after you leave today, have this be a living document. Feed feedback into Quincy and the team so they can make this even more useful. But also as you go through your planning process, keep taking notes, keep iterating as well. So you can just keep getting better and better. So let's jump in. All right, so step 1, identifying the ideal customer profile. Now, identifying the ICP, one could argue, me included, that it's really more of a marketing ops role versus a pure sales planning, sales ops role, We heard earlier today about the concept of customer ops, where the teams will eventually merge and come together. But I still wanted to include this as the first step, and that's for a couple of reasons. The first reason is, and maybe I'm biased because of the company I work for, but the customer should always be front and center of your mind. Everything you do in sales planning, you need to have that understanding of the customer. You are the link between the street and marketing, as well as all the other functions in the company. You know the most about the close rates. You know the most about what's working and not working, what the voice of the customer is saying from the street, right? You need to feed that back in. And then likewise, as marketing develops their target personas, their buyers, you need to feed that back into the sales team so that they can effectively structure their go-to-market. So let me give you a couple of examples. So one example could be is, let's say that it looks like industries is the way to go, right? All of our buyer personas are industry-focused. Well, if you're targeting doctors, you may want to verticalize your go-to-market, right? And have all of your sales teams go to market by vertical instead of by geography or some other segmentation model. Well, that's a big decision to make. Alternatively, if you're targeting the CXOs of a company, like the CFO, the CIO, then you may want to build out your pre-sales teams, right? And again, depending on the complexity of your company and all of those disclaimers, you may want to invest in value resources who can build that business case out and talk to the CFO. You may want to invest in specialist sales teams who can be who have the technical know-how to hold the conversation with the CIO. It has to be that continuous loop again.
Makes sense.
Number two is sizing the market. So market sizing, for those of you who have done it, and getting to a total addressable market, it's an art. It's a little bit of a science, it's a lot of art. And so it's all about triangulation. So what I put up on the slide is two of the most basic ways you could get to market sizing. Bottom up, top down, right? Bottom up, again, you know your products, you know what's going on in the market, you can make some hypotheses in terms of a bookings potential and average selling price. You multiply those out, sum them up, you get your total addressable market. Then external, right, the top down. You can look externally if you have the time and the energy, and you can look at competitors, see what the trends are, who have similar products. Again, multiply all that out, sum it up, great. You can go to a Gartner or an IDC, and you can supplement their information to make it more relevant for your company. And then you get a range. And then again, depending on the necessity, you can supplement that with additional white space analysis, sales manager judgment, to get what the whole pie is that you should be targeting.
So I've got a question on this one. I've always had a hard time kind of reconciling this idea of a total addressable market. This is what happens if we sell our product to every single person in the entire geography that we're selling to, or industry, or company segment. But then there's this also reality that there's this time component to it too. Sales people can't sell to everybody all at once, and it's going to take time to nurture some prospects. So how do you reconcile that, those two things, especially as you're thinking about setting targets and all of that?
Yeah, so there's different ways. You could either have the TAM be for an actual year, right? You'll see very sophisticated. In prior companies I worked for, we actually had multi-year TAMs that we did across it was a full stack company. So we had hardware, software, and services, and we had across every single geography to an nth level, we had estimates. The easier way to do it is to address that when you do your financial target setting, right? Because that'll be annualized. And then when you do your actual quota setting, because that'll be very much patch-based and territory-based as well.
Okay.
So we'll get into that soon. Financial targets. This is what I think about financial target setting. So you'll see a lot of Dilbert. I find Dilbert to have been running ops for so long to be a type of therapy for me. So it's how I relate. But again, setting financial targets, you could argue, but finance does that. So why should sales ops play a role? Well, again, you're the ones who actually see all the sales data. You know the capabilities of the sales teams. You know where the potential attrition risks are in terms of the sales teams. You know in terms of the feasibility of it. So you need to have a seat at the table to feed that into finance. You've also spent a lot of time just sizing the market, right, and thinking about the bookings potential. So you're going to have an informed, data-driven seat at the table with finance also. So that's the first thing, is to influence the inputs. Then, finance will set the targets, and oftentimes, in a lot of companies, these will be company-wide targets. So who's going to help them cascade that down by region, by product, and eventually by territory? Because that's going to tie very nicely into compensation. You should. So again, the tighter your relationship, and perhaps in some of your companies, if it's a small enough company, you may also be financed, in which case, more power to you. But if you're not, befriend your finance business partners and make sure you're in lockstep. I think.
Makes sense.
Capacity planning. Oh, capacity planning. So capacity planning is all about hiring the right people in the right role and at the right time. And so it's those three key elements. And so for capacity planning purposes today, super complicated process. I'm going to, again, oversimplify. And so very basic capacity planning in sales is linked to the core AE, right? So it's all about how do we determine our AE headcount, our core sales headcount, and then start layering on top of that. And the back of the envelope way to do it, and this is not, and again, this is not the way that I would necessarily go about it, is you take your financial targets and you think about, well, what's a reasonable burden for a salesperson to carry, divide that, and then you get your AE headcount, right? Now, you would also have to layer in expense. You would make sure you're not bankrupting the company by hiring that many heads. But back of the envelope, that's how you get to your AE capacity. Then you need to start thinking about your support resourcing, right? So support resourcing is pre-sales roles, and you could have a dozen. I've worked at companies where there's more than a dozen different types of pre-sales roles, right? Your sales engineers, your specialist sales roles, your value roles, and many others. And then your post-sales roles, right? All your customer success resources also. And then if needed, your partner relationship managers, right? You might be a company that relies really heavily on ISVs or SIs to be successful. And so you would want those people in your company also managing those relationships. How you determine support roles, there's again a multitude of ways. The most successful way that I've seen is ratio-based. So you need your segmentation, and then you apply a ratio to your AE headcount that's in those segments, because again, it's a very close partnership with AE as quarterback, and that's how you get the size of your supporting roles, right? So for instance, one sales engineer can handle X amount of AEs based on the patch size. And again, I say depending on segmentation, because as we'll show in the next slides, you don't want to have more people from your company showing up to the sales meeting that actually are employees at your customer. So you don't want to bring a dozen people if your customer has a dozen people as its full head count. That'd be a little awkward. So you want to make sure you stage that depending on the needs of the deal. So let's say now you have your AE capacity goals and you have your supporting resource goals. Fantastic. You compare that against your current head count. You have your growth then that's needed. That's your to be hired, right, pool. When do you hire them? And so that's what the hiring plan time series is, right? So it's how do you make sure that you don't bankrupt the company by hiring everyone day one, quarter, and month one, right, of your new fiscal year. But how do you make sure you hire them soon enough so they have enough time to ramp to be productive? And how do you prioritize the different patches and roles so that you're successful in tapping into that potentially identified? That's a negotiation, genuinely a negotiation between sales ops, between sales leadership and finance, and recruiting, because they know where the total addressable market is in terms of candidates as well. So they know what kind of pipe they have and who can be filled right away.
So thinking about the hiring plan time series and thinking about how to not bankrupt your company, but how to make sure you hit your financial goals, that seems super complicated. How do you think about it? Like, what metrics do you use, if any?
So it's a balance, right? It's seeing in terms of how many, by patch, you want a mix of leadership as well as individual contributor roles. So you want to make sure you don't hire one or the other ahead of time. You want to make sure that you have a mix of new hires and established roles, right? You don't want to have both AEs and supporting resources all be new at the same time because goodness knows that patch will suffer. So you want to have that balance. Mm-hmm. So it's all about balancing.
Okay.
Oops. Okay. So next, it's all about how do we segment, right? How do we carve? How do we create segments? How do we create territories? But before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, I want to take a step back and talk about what would happen if we didn't take the time to clearly define segments. And so on this slide, I have two graphs. The y-axis is opportunity size. The x-axis is number of companies, number of potential customers, right? And then you have this curve, which is focus from high to low. Salespeople, bless them, will hunt mammoths, right? So the left-hand side, you see my pink dot with the little mammoth? That is what they're going to go after. They're going to go after the biggest target. They will chase that mammoth down, they will declare victory, and there will be a parade. But what happens? You've got the dotted circle, which is the opportunity that is left potentially untapped, right? Because everyone's running after that mammoth. So very easily, because carving is a term that sometimes it's hard to explain to sales, especially new salespeople, it's just all about creating order, right? So just how you spread out that focus and that opportunity. And you can do this in a variety of ways. The classic way, sometimes the simplest way to do it, is based on company size, where you take employee headcount of companies and you group them together, right? And that's how you get your classic pyramid. And the classic pyramid is at the top of the pyramid, you have what can be called anything. We call enterprise or focus or key. Then you have your commercial bucket, and then you have your SMB bucket. And again, the more mature, the more complicated you become, the more you may create subsegments. Because segmentation then drives all of your financial metrics, all of your performance metrics. The more segments you have, the more accountability you force on your sales leaders also. In the top sphere, you'll see it says named companies, number of accounts. So in the top sphere, usually that's a named account list where you literally pluck logos, right? So these are the table stake companies that your grandparents have heard of, that you've decided to place all of your bets on. All of your bets, because if you look at the right-hand side, that's where all of your resources will go as well, if you decide to do this kind of model, right? So all those pre-sales roles that help tell the story to the Coca-Colas, the Procter & Gamble's of the world, that's where you would assign them. And then as you get to commercial and SMB, you snap the line at some employee count, right? Maybe it's 5,000, 3,000. Again, depends how low you want to go. And then you assign resources accordingly. And in the commercial and SMB space, you'd also balance the patches differently. So for the named accounts, you know what those accounts are. It's relatively simple to balance the patches. For the other two, we do regression scoring based on a number of characteristics, and then we stack rank portfolios and make sure that they're balanced as well.
Cool. I have two questions about this one. The first, so you talk about segmentation. I assume, or I actually know, Salesforce has a ton of segmentation. They're cutting by, carving by geography, industry, company size, and then geography again, and then company size again. For companies of different sizes, from like the 10 sales employees to the 100 sales employees to we had some over 1,000, how do you think about like when to introduce segmentation, when to start introducing that like serious focus, and when not? And second question is, how do you think about the different types of segmentation?
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple ones.
Day one. So if you don't do it from day one, everyone's going to be chasing the same thing, right? So segmentation is all about creating order. You don't have to be this complex from day one, right? It can literally, segmentation can be as simple as like, east, central, west, if you're just covering the US. Or if you're just in San Francisco, right, then you can do like South Bay Peninsula, Marin, East Bay, whatever. Doesn't matter how you cut it, it's assigning clear patches, clear buckets, and then you can start all that this pyramid is then just a grouping of those. And how do you think about it? The three typical ones that you called out, Quincy: geography, company size, industry, all of them have benefits and all of them have problems, right? There's no magic bullet. If you do it by geography, that's awesome. You can create sales hubs and incubate talent. But then if the Northeast tanks because of microeconomic problems, then all those salespeople can't make a good living, right? You could do it by company size, which is wonderful, because then you can really bring all the resources to bear to those biggest companies. But it might take you 3 years to convince that big mammoth to buy, and you've invested in all of these resources. Can you afford that? Is your company at that place? And then by industry, again, you speak the customer's language, you show the doctor's office, you've customized your product. But again, if that industry tanks, your salespeople don't have diversification of their portfolios. They'll maybe disincentive, attrition might go up. And is your product really ready as well? Because once you start talking the language and you start going to market that way, there's expectations that are set that your product can deliver and also speak that language of the customer. So there's pluses and minuses. We do a little bit of everything, right? We slice a lot to make sure that we have the right targeting. But we stage it as well. And we'll incubate a vertical before we go full out to market. So it's, again, a balance.
So you'll actually like run almost a kind of experiment to see if something is working. Like if someone has only prospects, are they more productive or not?
Yeah, or are we ready for a certain vertical even?
Are you ready for a certain?
Yeah,
so
we want to say launch it throughout the full pyramid. We'll start in one space and then slowly grow that out.
Do you start with the like SMB space, like
or
small
a
space,
particular geo?
Okay.
Even, yeah. Depends.
Interesting.
All depends. Okay, quote on compensation. So, more Dilbert. So this is the most emotionally charged and the most stressful part of the process for both sides, for both sales leaders as well as sales ops folks, right? Just the pressure that we all have in terms of if we set a target incorrectly, then again, we can bankrupt the company because everyone overachieves, their kickers kick in, more parades, but a final parade. And if we set it too high, then that's people's livelihoods, right? They're not going to make their number. They're not going to make the salary that they had budgeted for. And again, you're going to get attrition. So what's that right balance? So before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about what happens when this goes wrong. So on the left-hand side are two of my favorite Quota comics. The top one is a salesperson talking to their manager, and after getting their quota letter, and the manager is counseling them, saying, well, but it's supposed to be unrealistic. It's your sales quota, right? Then the bottom one is Dogbert giving a sales training seminar. And Dogbert is advising an audience of sales reps, probably a kickoff, saying, losers sell to customers. Winners sell the idea of low quota levels to their bosses. Now everyone do the cha-ching dance, right? So this is classic stereotype. You got to game the system. You got to bribe your sales ops leader. You need to push on your sales leader to make sure the quota is set low. So how do you start undoing this mindset, and how do you start setting the right quotas, right? So first, it's all about matching the plans to the business goals. You've gone through a rigorous sizing exercise, a rigorous carving exercise. You know the patches. You know what patches are greenfield patches, meaning there's just a lot of new logos and white space. And it's going to take a while to break in. You know what patches that are more investment, right? So maybe, again, a part of the country has microeconomic problems. Or maybe there's a place you have an install base, and it's going to take a little longer to sell an additional license, an additional product. Set those targets differently. Do not peanut butter across. Secondly, match the targets to the needs of the individual sales team. Simplest example are new hires. What is the right ramp? I heard people earlier throw out 6 months. So yes, if you are of a certain size, and certain product set, maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's 3 months, maybe it's 3 weeks. Whatever it is, it's not day one, right? Day one, they need to figure out where the bathroom is, log into their computer, and set up their email address, right? So whatever that is, put yourself in their shoes and make sure you give them enough time to learn, but hit that right balance. Buffer. So buffer, some people call it overassign, some people call it padding. The concept of buffer is that if you take all of your financial targets and you sum those up, and then you sum up your quota sum is greater than your financial target sum because of that buffer. And that padding is added at every single level of the management hierarchy. The reason being that if, for some reason, sales does not hit their quota, you hope they make it into that buffer zone. Because if they do, you're still going to hit the financial targets for the company, right? And what you report to your board, or report to the street, you're still going to make those numbers. So that's the concept of buffer. And buffer is an art also, in terms of how you set it. And then lastly, empathy. This was also a theme. So in sales strategy at Salesforce, we used to, so I actually, for the last couple of years, I've been in a field role, but we used to have all sales strategy folks shadow sales dev. So shadow, at a minimum, SDR, so the most junior sales resources, just to get a feel of that pressure and get a feel of that life cycle. Shadow. If you can't shadow, read. So a long time ago, a gentleman on my team gave me a book called Chasing Quota by Walter Brown. If you haven't read it, it's fantastic. It's one sentence snippets all about how to be a sales leader. That's all it is. And so it's how do you hire a team, how do you manage a team, and it really puts you in that mindset of a sales leader and the pressures they feel and how they think. But really developing that empathy, understanding them, it'll go a long way when you start communicating some of these more uncomfortable topics.
It's funny, we were talking about empathy yesterday, and I think it's been really interesting to see that every single session today has touched on empathy and on the need of understanding things from the sales rep and the sales manager's perspective, which is hard, just throwing it out there for our normal job with metrics, and then throw in the people side too, but makes it interesting.
It does. It does.
Okay, so what I've heard a lot of, or the thing for me hearing about all these different steps is it's all about alignment. It's about figuring out your ICP and then aligning market size to that, and then aligning financial targets to market size, and then aligning, I think we did capacity planning, and then carving, and then quota. So it's all about alignment, and theoretically at this point we have an extremely aligned plan with all of our different resources, and we actually need to take that, which is living sort of in one place generally, and put it into execution, which really has two parts to it. One is there's the people side of things, which has been talked about a little bit on developing empathy and understanding how to push everything out to all the people on the front line. That's a lot about sales enablement. It's a lot about creating the right content, making sure that product marketing is aligned, customer success understands the way that the plan is getting enacted in terms of customer interactions. And then there's also the technology side of things. There's people and there's technology, and how to implement that plan into all of your tools, into all of your systems is another part. And I guess today we've got a current state of things, which we like to call ops hell. I think some people might resonate a little bit with this. We've got a lot of different Excel versions, bad data, never-ending configuration. Dharmesh talked a little bit about this morning, but and Bala kind of walked through how Fullcast is thinking about trying to create a platform. We won't go into any of that, but it's a challenge today. You hire a lot more. You basically hire CRM administrators and IT support as your company scales at a percent of your overall target. And that's how it works. 6%, 8%, 10% of overall sales targets as your company grows. We think you can do better. But anyway, neither here nor there. Plans implemented. Last step. Not really about planning at all, but something I think that resonates with everybody in this room, everyone in sales operations. Performance review, metrics, making data-informed decisions. Don't need to talk too much about the importance of this, but wanted to leave y'all with some suggestions on this. The first one is that with so many metrics out there, sometimes it's hard to know exactly what you should be thinking about. And so one of the things that I think we did really well at Salesforce and Fullcast recommends to the people that we're supporting is have one like North Star metric. One thing that at the end of the day, this is your number. This is how you know if you are performing. The example that we have here and the one that we like a lot is attainment, because it takes both your plan, your quota and your targets, and your bookings, your execution, and it puts the two together. You can see there are a lot of metrics that go up underneath bookings. Quota and targets have a lot of thought put around them, but everything kind of rolls up underneath attainment. So think about that North Star metric. Second, have a regular review, regular cadence for reviewing these metrics, whether it's a weekly pipeline council, a monthly metrics pack, some time to step away from the execution, daily execution, and look at how you are performing in order to make changes to whatever plan you've already set. You need to always be thinking about, so what? Like, what does this metric actually mean? And then, again, this has been talked about a little bit. Think about collecting qualitative data from your sales teams, because at the end of the day, you might see something in the data, but some of the smartest decisions that I've made before showing sales manager at Salesforce data was actually sitting down with a sales rep and say, hey, this is what I think I'm seeing. Does this make sense? And they'd be like, oh, well, there's all this other stuff that you should be thinking about. It's like, okay, thank you for not making me look like an idiot. Yeah, so that's review performance. That's step number 8. It all circles back around. So we've talked up to review performance. Reviewing performance is going to influence your definition of your ICP. That goes back around. In our view, sales planning is really something that happens all the time. It's something Salesforce, it sounds like, is thinking about regularly. And we really strongly encourage you guys to always be thinking about not only how are we doing today, but where are we going? Sales ops is in a really interesting position between all of the different parts of the organization. You get to influence marketing, product, sales, HR, everything, which is really cool. It's also sometimes stressful, but this is an always-on process that you can really use to add strategic value to your company. So with that, we're open to
Any
Q&A.
questions? So then you layer in the segmentation, right? So you start looking at it in terms of what is past performance in terms of your segments, what's your open pipe, what's your estimated close rates in terms of the team that you have, and how much do you need actual AEs versus the supporting cast, right? And doing more of that balance versus just starting with the AEs as your bucket and your anchor. Yes. So we are. So full disclosure, which I said, so the last 2 years I decided to, which is really funny that Sealy said the same thing, and a couple of other people, Ryan did as well. So I decided to take a field role. So I've been leading a field team, enterprise field team in customer success. And actually, the start of our fiscal year, I'm now back in strategy and ops, but doing corporate strategy now. So I don't know what the latest is, but I know that we are doing a lot more of our own reporting and analytics in Einstein, and it's also feeding a lot in terms of our bookings potential analyses as well. So it's being built into, but the latest and greatest, I know we're incubating a lot, but I'm not sure. So there's two, so let me answer that question, break that up in a few ways. So I think there's one element in that, which is if the sales teams can't hit their target because they don't have enough people. So the first piece there is making sure you protect the team and you maintain the people you have and keep them as happy as you can. And so that gets into like the whole buffering. So a lot of times the manager will hold more quota than the sum of the parts, right? Meaning that whatever AEs you have in place, their quota won't sum up to the manager's quota. The manager will have to make up the difference. How? They just have to make up the difference. So protecting that. That also then quite motivates to make sure that referrals come from everybody. And I think that's a little bit of company culture too. It is hard. It's some markets, it's tough. It's super tough to hire. So it's thinking broadly, but also making sure that everyone's always referring and everyone's always trying to feed that pipeline too. But companies that I've worked for, and I've done sales strategy at a few of them, longest at Salesforce, there's been really tight links with recruiting and with HR. And so we've been fairly lucky, but there is pain. The number has to be hit. Like regardless, the number has to be hit. There will be a quarterly business review. There's going to be a pipeline, a weekly forecast call. It doesn't matter. That still needs to go. So,
And
yeah.
to add to that,
Yeah.
what I remember is that you'd set the timeline, time series, and say, here's your hiring plan for the year. Here's your quota for the year. We're going to help support you on the hiring timeline, essentially like when those hires start coming up. But if you want to hire someone faster, if you find someone for this role, if you want to be proactive about recruiting, we're not going to dock you on quota. You essentially get like a free head, and that's like everything a salesperson needs.
Making sure you don't bankrupt the company, so you may have to trade some things across. But yes.
But it's putting it back on the salesperson and saying, you're responsible for your quota. We're not going to dock you for this. Being proactive, and we'll support you to make sure that you get that head when we say you're going to get it. But by all means, like, go find the right people.
Yeah, this is good. You're showing the carrots, and I'm doing the performance. Like, are you hitting it?
I didn't have to dock any salespeople. Maybe that's why.
Most drastically, we will recarve. So so to answer your question, yes, everything. So depending what happens, we will, worst case scenario, do a full recarve, where we will create some disruption with customers, trying to minimize it, and reassign territories and remix, right? We may also take a look at our capacity plan, our hiring time series, and realize, goodness, we need more supporting roles. Like we're just, we had a big acquisition or something else happened, and we really need people to help explain that link, so we need to reallocate budget there. If the targets are kind of the targets, right? So your board or your shareholders, those are like the last point of no return. If you have to start changing the targets, then it's bad place to be. So those I haven't seen touched in companies I've supported, and maybe I've just been lucky in terms of being at companies at the right time when they're still growing. But we'll readjust quotas, we'll readjust other things, but the targets will leave. We may cascade them differently. So if, like, let's say mid-year EMEA is doing unbelievable, then we may throw more burden on their leaders, right? And have to have them deal with it to carry a mare or vice versa. But the company level targets we try to leave. So splits and holdouts were my least favorite arbitration conversations. I don't know what the latest policy was. I think it was 3 months.
That's what I remember too.
Yeah. I think it was 3 months. So 1 quarter was the time frame. Some of that also differed based on segment, right? Because in some of the segments you have more organic buying versus meaning that it'll never actually be forecasted, right? Because some accounts just add more licenses in our model, and yay, we didn't really have to do much, just it added. So it depends on that, but at most 2 quarters, but I think we whittled it down to 90 days.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just adjust a little bit the timeline. So the presidents of the company work with sales strategy leadership to come up with a segmentation model, the high-level segmentation model, in August. So that actually starts in August. The actual carving and getting the second-line managers involved, I totally agree. That starts around Thanksgiving. Our fiscal year is February to February, right? So, and there have been certain years where the number shifts in January, right? And what you do is you do scenarios, right? So you do scenarios where you have, best case, worst case, and then where you think it's going to land, and you adjust on that. But it does create more churn for the team. So.
It was especially hard at Salesforce, where it felt like 40-ish% of sales would come in Q4, maybe 50.
Yeah.
So you're making these plans, you're coming up with financial targets, but numbers are constantly changing up, even until like the last week, when all the big deals come in, when all the customers are holding out for the best discount because the salesperson really needs to hit their number. So those scenarios were always really important. We'd say, you might have 3 direct reports, or you might have 5 direct reports. How do you want to carve up the entire US? You might have a west, central, east, or you might have a northwest, southwest, central, northeast, southeast. Here are what your patches are going to look like. Let's make 3 decisions and then hope that one of those is the one that gets picked.
It's all about also, and this, it's all about having your guideposts. So if you have, if you hold to your guns and you've decided as to what are those constraints, right? What are those priorities in terms of how you do the planning process? If you're good about not changing the overall design, then yes, the span of control might change. Some of the patches may change, but either whatever tool you use, that isn't as difficult once you have that scenario planning. It does. What throws some things off is if you throw in, a new vertical at the last minute or something along those lines. That isn't as tough of a decision, of a process. That will burn out your team. But it's more in terms of when it's big sweeping decisions that I found that'll have just huge cascading effects. So, yeah, but scenarios.